Hello and welcome to YAGR, your one-stop shop for high-quality game reviews. Today we will be doing our deep dive on Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice by Ninja Theory Games. Our playthrough team has spent roughly 12 hours in-game at the point of making this deep dive. On to the review, first starting where we always do with art and graphics. The game is beautiful. It is expertly crafted, and the team at Ninja Theory have put in so much time and effort in researching accurate ways to depict all the different cultures of lore that they use within this game. From Viking to Pict to the stories from Hell that the Vikings used to tell, as well as different kinds of ways to present information from people who have suffered from psychosis and people who have studied psychosis. They meshed it all together, and it looks pretty amazing, to say the least. The character design of pretty much the primary, and one could argue roughly the only character in the game, Senua, her design is very interesting. She looks and feels powerful, but she doesn't feel like the fantasy hero muscle-bound woman charging through destroying everything. She has a very natural air to her. She looks like a normal human woman. You know, she doesn't have the chiseled jawline and over-accentuated features. She looks natural. And I think that's very, very cool. Particularly the way her eyes move and look, there seems to be a depth within them that you can kind of find yourself getting lost in if you just look at her character model. And I think that's representative of the fact that she is portrayed with psychosis, and you can see it in her eyes and the way they flick back and forth. So they graphically represented a lot of what they were looking to do very well. As far as the environment goes, it looks pretty impressive throughout. You get some pretty significant changes as you go through the game. From a forested region, you find yourself in a swamp, in an underground labyrinth at one point, and of course, the whole purpose is to trudge through hell. So eventually you get there as well, and the art style and what you see happening around you and the world constructed around you is truly different and perplexing and unnerving as hell in a lot of places, because of the art and graphics they used, in addition to some other factors we'll be discussing later on. But overall, graphics and art, very nice. The only complaints I have as far as that is there's a couple moments in the game, and I think it has to do with the way the wind impacts Senua's clothing. It causes some kind of animation stuttering. Basically, the fur shawl she wears, and I think one or two other locations on her clothing, ends up stuttering and bouncing up and down rapidly. But it's not consistent throughout the whole game. It only happens once or twice, and it's pretty minor. It's not like it's glitching through her body or anything. It's just kind of bouncing up and down as if it was supposed to be slowly waving, but something got messed up there. It's not really a big deal. The other complaint I have is some of the graphics and visual effects they use are excellently representing the theme, but negatively impacting the gameplay. A significant portion of the game you have to solve these puzzles, and we'll get into more specifics later, but basically you have to look for things around the map. And sometimes there's a lot of overlaying and motion blurring and lens flaring going on, and it's really hard to follow and find exactly what you're looking for, not because it's well hidden, but because of all these artificial layers that are placed on top of it, and that can get a little annoying. And when we're talking about effects graphics getting annoying, this rolls into a bigger bug, which we will spend some time discussing specifically, but there is a period in the game where Senua is on fire, and this fire graphic is oppressive. Like, it's huge on her character model, and it stays on her, and it's rapidly flipping and flying everywhere and casting all these shadows, and it's super bright. And when you're in the middle of trying to do something else that requires you to be very attentive, it's extremely distracting. I understand that distracting the player is a strong component to make the theme and atmosphere of the game, but this felt way overdone when everything else had been done so well. They could have toned down the graphic on Senua's actual character for the fire, because this was way blown out of proportion. Like, that combined with other visual effects of lens flaring on it, it's almost blinding and painful to the eyes to watch. But outside of those 2 or 3 little things, the characters and enemies are represented beautifully in the art style, and you can very much see the influences of the various cultures used to design this world. So, we will now be moving on to sound design. Sound design is a very important key factor in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, as was stated by Ninja Theory in their dev diaries from developing through the game, and as is very apparent from the second you start playing the game after you hit New Game from the main menu. The way they've designed it, and the actual mechanical way they did it for recordings is very interesting, but the way they've designed it within the game, it truly shines if you play it with headphones, and it recommends that. And basically what happens is you end up hearing these voices first in one ear, then the other, then flickering between the two and at both, and then sometimes not at all, and you get this feeling of all these different voices in your head as the player, and it really immerses you in the idea of what Senua must be feeling. And these voices, it's really frustrating because it makes it hard to think as the player, so you can only imagine how it is if that was actually the case throughout your entire life. But not only that, the way they've designed the sound and what the voices actually say and when they cue shows a serious internal conflict within her that really drives the story, because some of the voices are actually helpful and encouraging. Senua, you can do it. She can do it. Get up and fight. You know, things like that. And then an overwhelming number of them are, oh, she can't do it. Oh, it's a trick. We told you it's a trick. What are you even doing? Things like that. And it's super negative and just really frustrating when you're like, shut up. I know it's what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, the story's on rails. Of course that was supposed to happen. But you have all these voices whispering in your ears constantly, no matter what you're doing in the game, telling you that you're bad. And it's just this really immersive and frustrating, but thematically appropriate design of these voices popping in your ears. And I think Ninja Theory hit gold with that. That was very cool. Outside of that, for sound, the enemies have key sound cues, which are very important. Finding solutions to puzzles or even activating puzzles is extremely important. And not only that, but in the middle of combat, some of those voices will tell you when you're being attacked from behind, or kind of help you cue when you need to start moving out of the way of an attack. So in fact, there is a very tactical and important approach to having your sound on for the game as well. And because of that, the subtitles need to be very accurate for those who are hard of hearing or unable to have sound while they play, or just simply can't hear as individuals. Which brings us to the next point for sound is, as far as combat goes and things like that, the subtitles are more or less correct, and they work. But when it comes to the story, I've noticed playing with subtitles on and audio, the subtitles don't have everything or don't exactly perfectly match what the voice in the game is saying. In fact, in some cases, entire sentences are left out. So I feel like that may have been an oversight, or maybe it was something lost in translation. I'm not quite sure, but it's kind of a sad oversight because they're leaving out a key group of gamers, which is people who depend on subtitles. And not only that, but that impacts people who play on Twitch or play the game on YouTube and things like that, because then if someone's just watching the gameplay without the sound on, or they're having trouble hearing the Twitch stream or something, etc., they're not going to be getting the full effect of the game. They weren't going to be getting the full effect anyway, because it's very important to have that alternating left-right sound effect, and it is very important as well just walking through the world because everything is directionally based, but the inaccuracies within the subtitles is a very sad and upsetting problem that Ninja Theory kind of just let go through the cracks, I think. But outside of that, the actual sounds of the game are great. The rustling of wind, the cracking of fire, the smashing of swords and maces, the audible feedback you feel when you get hit in the face by an enemy or one sneaks up and stabs you in the back, the growling of some of the monsters you have to deal with, the screaming and echoing and audible transformations that occur when Senua starts having breakdowns and things like that. It's really interesting. And also, I talked about how it is a tactical effect. Without spoiling anything, particularly one of the boss fights, not only is there tactile feedback if you're using a controller, you get a little vibration when you're at the right spot, but you can use that sound to determine where you're supposed to go for puzzles, or in this fight, where the enemy is going to be coming from next, based on how loud a certain sound that you hear is, depending on where you look and where you move. So they not only incorporated the actual combat mechanics they've built, but they've incorporated sound into the actual combat as well, which is truly interesting. I've seen a couple games try similar things like that, and the three-dimensional sound aspect is obviously going to assist with that in any scenario, but Hellblade did it really well and really interesting, making it an integral component. In fact, in one of the dev diaries they talk about it, and I'm going to mention it here, there is a part of the story where effectively you have no vision. Like, you can kind of make out some things, and if you up your gamma, you can kind of get some shapes in the shadows, but effectively you as the player and Senua as the character don't have vision, and you have to rely on the sound of what's underneath your feet and moving very slowly and listening to one of the voices in her head talk her through it and help her figure her way through. And again, it shows a very interesting tactical and gameplay perspective feel of having to depend on senses other than sight as a gamer, because we're all about being visually appeased and visually flooded with information when we play games. We're very used to that, and Hellblade takes us out of that comfort zone, which brings us to that unnerving feeling and different things contributing to that. It's truly a unique experience to play this game. I think that is great, and if you're okay coming out of your comfort zone, it's a great reason to get Senua's Sacrifice. But we're not done with the deep dive yet. That covers sound. Next, we're going to move on to gameplay. And first, we're gonna break gameplay into two sections. First, we're gonna go over combat gameplay. Next, we'll go over puzzle and other gameplay, basically. And then we'll do a short summary to see how they mesh together and work out overall throughout the overarching game experience. So, I said first we're going to start with combat, and one of the things that we as the playthrough team here at YAGR felt on our first impressions was combat felt pretty stiff. But it also helped in the realism factor in that you're not going to be flipping and flying and spinning and tossing blades and things like that in combat, and that was most certainly not what these picked people were trained to do, which is what Senua is. They were much more practical in their combat. So we thought it was kind of a thematic design to make it a little more static, but the more we played, the more we realized that's not necessarily the case. And it's not necessarily that the animations are particularly stiff. They are stiff in the beginning and end of the animation for very specific reasons, I feel. And what our playthrough team noticed is the reason they have these stiff frames is because there are a lot of different ways you can go in your effectively combo chain when you're fighting. You could do a series of light attacks, you could alternate light and heavy, you could do any combination of those, and then you can also add dodges in the middle of combos as well, and you get another fighting mechanic later on in the game that changes some things you can do as well. So they have these stiff frames because the game itself doesn't know the direction that you're going to go with your combo, so they need kind of a blank canvas in between each step. And in fact, when you find chains that you like to use, the combat stops feeling quite so stiff, and it starts feeling much more flowing, and you can put together these series of movements, and it's so much better than the initial feel. The problem with having this system this way is a lot of players aren't going to discover this until a significant portion of the way through the game. And that's for two reasons. One, the game never teaches you how to combat, outside of a couple comments the voices in Senua's head say to you, such as focus now, or charge your heavy attack, or, you know, dodge now, move out of the way, surprise him, things like that. It never says, here is a list of combos you can do in any menu or throughout gameplay experience. It also never tells you, yeah, if you can do these dashing strikes, or you can strike immediately after a dodge, or things like that. And it never mentions perfect block. There's a parry function. Basically, it's your standard perfect block function you've seen in a million different games. So once you know it's there, then it's like a second skin, but it never tells you it's there. It's something you have to explore and feel out for yourself, which is okay, but there's a certain expectation in games where the player is going to be taught to some degree how to do it, particularly when it comes to combat, because it's so integral. And not only that, but the penalty for dying too much in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is you lose your entire save file. And you can only have one at a time, from what I understand. So the lack of teaching people, even if it's the basic combat that so many of us are used to, in addition to the heavy penalty for not being able to perform combat effectively and appropriately, is a very, very dangerous mix. So my recommendation would be, take your time with the combat, and when it gives you the opportunity, make some space and work things out for yourself a little bit. So those are some major concerns and changes from first impressions to now about the combat system. Another thing is, you have this focus mechanic, which will roll us into puzzles in a second, where basically Senua focuses her eyes and can see a little bit further in the distance and searches for patterns and things like that within the world, which has to do with some of the psychosis research they did, which is very interesting. They talk about it extensively in the dev diaries. But it actually has a combat function, and they sort of hinted at it, and again, it's through the voices in her head and one particular combat where you discover that enemies can shroud themselves in this kind of shadow form and you can't hurt them, but if you focus, it will dispel the shadow and you can hurt them. That's great, and I think it's cool, and they most certainly teach you that component of the focus mechanic in combat. But what I didn't know is it actually slowed down time, which can significantly improve your combat experience. In fact, I don't know how you beat some of these combat situations without that mechanic. And the fact that they never stated that, and it wasn't blatantly obvious when it happened the first time or two, I felt like I was missing out, and I struggled when I didn't need to because I wasn't aware of all the mechanics. Not only that, but you have a specific number of charges, and I guess they recover over time, or maybe if you perform specific moves in combat, they recover quicker, is what I was feeling. But again, it never teaches you the specifics of this mechanic. It's just kind of this muddy mess that you have to work around. One cool thing about it, though, is the mirror Senua carries around, which has a story purpose I won't spoil for you, also represents when you have focus charges. Effectively, I believe it's up to 3, and it fills out this pattern on the back of the mirror, and basically the pattern, each piece of it glows when you have a charge available. And I thought that was a really cool way to represent it while avoiding the need for the HUD, because you're always facing Senua's back in combat, so that's where the data is coming and flowing into you as the player. So I thought that was a very cool aspect of it, and I thought they did that really well. And it was a clever way to avoid the need for anything related to a HUD, which other games have done, and it can work, but again, not having those kind of explanation of mechanics is severely hindering to Hellblade as a game. That is why I still firmly believe this would have been, or at least is better described as, an interactive experience. And frankly, I would have loved to seen Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, the animated movie, over Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, the game. Because that's what it feels like I'm doing, is I'm watching and playing a movie, not a game. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. So that covers kind of our concerns with combat and our renewed feelings. I don't think it's as stiff as I originally claimed, but it is still very much kind of a mystery, even after 12 hours of playing it. I'm still not really sure, like, all the tools I have available to me playing through it. and that's kind of annoying, especially approaching the end of the game here, where I know I'm going to need every tool at my disposal. One other thing to note about the combat, though, is throughout most of the first half of the game, it felt like combat was very scarce. Outside of the boss fights and a couple of smaller fights where you encounter enemies and the types of enemies very, very slowly grow in the first half of the game, there's only a few fights and the bosses. And then there is a certain mark in the game where you are just flooded with enemies and difficult fights. And the fact that you have no control over the camera, outside of flicking which target you focused on during combat, and the camera feels kind of close to Senua as the character, it's very frustrating because you constantly can get surrounded, and Senua moves very slowly through most of the game, and that holds true for combat. Her fastest moves are her side dodges, and that can kind of help you get all the enemies on one side of you, but it's very difficult, so you're heavily relying on those sound cues we discussed. And because of that difficulty from having that locked camera in combat and things like that, not explaining the combat system fully and completely to the players just makes it that much more unnecessarily difficult and can be fairly frustrating, especially when the enemies have a distinct advantage against you as the player. With being able to hide behind you, their footsteps don't make a particularly large amount of noise, a couple of attacks have sound cues, but not being able to look around yourself and depending wholly on the voices inside Senua's head, which will be saying other things besides look out behind you in the middle of combat and distracting you, it's annoying. It's frustrating. You feel cheated when you get hit from behind like that. So I think either the combat system is too simple to enable a locked camera like that, or not well enough explained to enable the player to successfully deal with situations like that. I think it could have been evaluated a little bit more based on camera work in addition to the combat, in addition to how the combat was introduced. That kind of trifecta of teaching, experiencing, and then how it was built. Those three things need to work together very seamlessly, and I feel like at least one of those links is not fully developed. But overall, combat flowed decently. It definitely is not the selling point of the game, and some people are going to be cool with it, and others are going to hate it. So be prepared for that if you're looking into Hellblade. Next, for gameplay, we're going to move on to the second half, which is the puzzles and other, essentially. There's pretty much two things that happen, we'll say three things that you do for gameplay inside of Hellblade. You fight, you solve puzzles, and you walk. Those are basically the things that you do in Hellblade. It's very simple overall. We've covered the fighting, so we're going to talk about the puzzles. The puzzles are actually really interesting and cool. I thought it was an exciting way to introduce progressing through the story. Basically, you're met with these walls or doors or gates that are locked by these magic runes that only people with something called the Sight can see, and of course your character Senua has the Sight. And basically hidden throughout the three-dimensional world you can travel through are these runes that you have to find that will unlock the door. And when I say hidden, I mean literally hidden within the world. It's not just a thing painted on a wall all the time. I think in the first door, that's what it is, and it's never that again. Basically, you have to change your perspective as Senua and stand in the right place, looking at the right objects to make this symbol overlaying the perspective of the things. It's very interesting and very cool. Like, for example, there's broken beams in a house, and if you turn a torch on behind the beams and stand at the right angle, the shadow cast through the broken beams onto the floor then becomes the symbol that you need to find to unlock the door. That's really cool. Manipulating the world to invent the symbols you need and finding them and using that to unlock progression is super cool. And it goes with the research into psychosis that they went into, of a lot of psychosis patients feeling like they can see things that others can't, and they can find patterns and associations that may not be very obvious to someone who is more sound of mind. And you very much get that feeling with Senua. And in order to find these things, you actually make Senua act as if she has psychosis sometimes, walking back and forth between these portals and running back on the path to go find something that you think you missed that is important to unlocking the door in front of you. One thing that we were a little disappointed with is, through the first half of the game, most of the puzzles weren't as difficult as we thought they were. And the reason a lot of our playthrough team thought that the puzzles were more difficult than they were is the voices in our head. They're constantly naysaying Senua, saying, "No, go back. You can't go this way. Why are you here? Go back." And throughout the game, a significant number of the time, the voices in her head are actually helpful. And you think they're trying to guide you to the right location and provide you with information about the world relevant to what you're trying to do. And for the most part, that is significantly true. But there's a lot of in-between times that you're unclear as to whether the voices in her head are a component of what you're doing now, or just part of the game experience that's supposed to make it harder for you to think and immerse you within Senua. So making that distinction ended up having us running all over the place when the answer was actually very simple and right in front of us. That might show a very well-designed disjoint between the way someone in Senua's mind would think versus the way a sound person's mind thinks. Or that might just be bad timing on the audio cues, and maybe they should have used a different line than "go back," repeated over and over in your ear. That remains to be seen. We're not sure about the answer here at YAGR, and we'll leave that up to you as the players to decide. But it did provide a little bit of confusion and frustration. However, the longer you go on through the game, you learn to understand, I'm never going to have to go too far back to solve these puzzles. And that kind of goes into how the first half of the game, the puzzles are a lot simpler than you think they are. And the second half of the game, that's when you hit the kind of complex puzzles of, I need to go here and do this, then run all the way back around to the other side and do this and unlock this door and yada yada yada. And it gets much more complicated. So Senua's Sacrifice is actually a combat and a puzzle game put in one, and it's a rather intriguing puzzle game that has some unique aspects to it. In addition to the puzzles, there are mazes as well. And they can be fairly difficult, but certainly not something that feels out of the realm of capable for a player to deal with. If you are particularly scared of dark scenes, or horrifying creatures, or gruesome scenes, then the mazes can be very unnerving and difficult for players to get through. But that is part of the game. That is the world that Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice takes place in. And walking into the game, you need to be prepared for that. So that is not a problem with the game. That is players having to accept that unnerving feeling and experience it with Senua and move on through that and solve the problems. And that kind of goes over the puzzles. And then the other bit that I wanted to talk about as far as gameplay goes is there are little bits and bobs of lore and kind of Viking history that, as far as I'm aware of, and according to the dev diaries, is accurate. And they're represented in these things called lore stones, which you focus on, and then you get a nice little voiceover, and it tells you some component of an ancient Viking story about the gods. And these are really cool. They're some of the most interesting things in the game. Like, I want to find the next lore stone to hear about how, you know, the legend of Fafnir and things like that. And it's super cool, but there's two problems I have with it. One, a lot of times they don't seem relevant to what I'm doing at the time. They feel like something that was added in to flush the world out and make it feel more thematically appropriate. Which, if that was the only purpose, then cool. But it would have been even better if they were more associated with what I was doing at the time. I don't know if that would have been possible at all, but it feels kind of like a disjoint. The other thing with these lore stones is sometimes the voices in Senua's head, and particularly there is one or two primary voices that sound distinct within her head, and those are kind of the storytelling mechanics, and they're the ones that, if they speak, you know it's important. Sometimes that voice in her head, the actual audio cue for her telling that story overlaps with the likely time frame you're going to find and activate a lore stone, and the voice in her head obviously dominates the lore stone's voice. So you're sitting there waiting for this voice in her head to finish talking so that you can stand there and listen to the lore stone tell you a story. The spacing of these things is kind of annoying because you'll end up standing there and listening to the story, which isn't a bad thing, but it's for an extended period of time due to a mechanical impreciseness within the game. Because a simple way to fix this is make lore stones audible regardless of distance to the stone, which you have to stay fairly close to them to hear it when it speaks. So that's the first thing you could have done if you were designing this game. And the second thing is, instead of having them play over each other and then just silencing the lore stone's track until the main voice's track is done talking, is cue it up so that the lore stone begins when the main voice in Senua's head ends talking. But instead, it's the other way around. The lore stone just gets muted and picks up whenever the voice in her head stops talking, and you start in the middle of the lore stone story, and you don't know what the hell is going on unless you stand there and wait. So that is the other component of it that I kind of had an issue with. I love the actual lore it gives you. I think it's really cool to learn about that stuff. And I love the way the story is presented through the voices in her head, but there's a serious disjoint with lore stones, and they don't mesh well with the actual primary story going on. So if you want the full picture and to learn everything the game can provide, it's going to extend your gameplay in a non-gaming fashion of having to just stand there and wait for the words to come out so you can experience everything. I think that could have been designed a little bit better. So that kind of goes over gameplay with perspective to combat and puzzles / mazes and other things. The next thing I want to talk about are the bosses, of course avoiding spoilers. Each boss has a unique attack pattern and some interesting mechanics that you have to work around within the fight, and that is nothing new to video games. But I think they're pretty solidly designed. I think they're unique and thematic enough to be able to appreciate. But the expectation management from the first two bosses to the third one is not there. The first two bosses are a challenge, but once you figure out the attack pattern and you can adjust and react appropriately, they don't take forever. They're not long fights. And then, after going through a slog through darkness and terror to get to the third boss, this fight takes a long time, and it is very easy to make mistakes. That being said, we've successfully done it first time through, so it's not terribly hard once you figure out what's going on. But once you figure out the nuances of the fight, you stop going, man, this is a cool fight, and you start going, oh my god, is this over yet? And that is the wrong feeling to have by the end of a boss fight. So I don't know if it needed to have more mechanics, or maybe it just needed to be shortened a little bit, but that fight took a very long time. Moving on to progressing through past that, it feels like they jammed a bunch of extra and more difficult and long combats after that boss through the story. The setting that they occurred in makes a lot of sense, but I would have rather seen more combat sparse throughout the game than feeling like it was all jammed in the second half or last third of the game, which is very much what it feels like. You have a little bit of combat here, a little bit of combat here, beat the first two bosses, a little bit more combat, get to the third boss, and then just combat, and it's really frustrating, and you're just like sitting there saying, is this real? Am I supposed to purposely die here? Is that what the game wants? And it just constantly drags on until you finally finish the combat sequence and you move on with the story. And I would have rather just had a more consistent flow of conflict than this bulbous section of massive amounts of combat tacked on in the last third or two-thirds of the, or half of the game, really. So that was one of the frustrating feelings as far as gameplay and boss progression goes. That's kind of, I'm tacking that in with bosses because it's based on in between the third and final boss of the game. It feels like it's a consistent boss fight from the third to the fourth boss fight. You're just constantly fighting. which in retrospect it's kind of cool and it's very thematic and appropriate to what's going on in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, but goddamn, as a gamer, is that annoying. I would have much rather been fighting throughout the game than having it all happen at once. Next, we're going to talk about plot and story. The plot and story of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is a unique gem that is what the game is about. If you are a gamer who does not care about the plot and story of a game, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is not for you. In fact, multiple times our playthrough team found that the only thing pushing them through the game was wanting to know what is going to happen next, or wanting to find justification and reason for things that have happened. It wasn't the enjoyment of the combat, it wasn't the thrill of solving the puzzle, it wasn't necessarily the horror of going through the world that had been built. It is the wanting to know why and the what next that drove our playthrough team to going through the game. The plot is rich. The world that it is built in is rich. The history and accuracies of the lore provided is unique and beautifully represented. And trying to piece together the story of what happened to Senua before this point and why she is willing to go through this mess for this person that you, at the beginning of the game, know nothing about other than that he is dead, his soul is in hell, and you carry his head. And the fact that the story is powerful enough to be the sole driving factor to push someone to go through the game is very difficult to accomplish. But Ninja Theory has most certainly done that with Hellblade. If you are driven by story and plot within a game, you need to be prepared for the difficulties that Hellblade will provide in the way everything is presented to you, and the challenges that a reasonably difficult game will present. But the story behind Hellblade is truly and magnificently weaved together and displayed and fed to you in a unique way that I believe truly represents the feelings and thoughts they wanted to have behind Senua as a character. I say this as a gamer who has played the game, but I also say this as someone who has done research into Ninja Theory's development of the game and watched all of their dev diaries and even looked up the actual original story behind Senua, who is a mythical character in actual lore of the world, our real world. Shocking, I know. But its representation in the way it is purely and perfectly weaved together with the history of the world and the lore that's been developed for the game is pristine. And if that is something you value in a game, then Hellblade will absolutely be worth the $30 US it will cost you to get it. However, if you play a game and expect it to be a game and aren't always magically mystified by the story and the plot, then Hellblade should be something you look a little more shrewdly at and question if you actually want. That's pretty much all I can say about the story without spoiling anything. So we're going to leave story and plot at that. And if you value story and plot in a game and feel like that is the one thing that can drive you to complete a game, then Hellblade will absolutely do that for you. I am not concerned about that recommendation at all. So, I think that covers the major points within Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice that are worth reviewing. There are certainly many other aspects of the game that we could spend time talking about, but they neither aid or detract as much as the things that we have discussed do from the game. So next we're going to talk about this glaring bug I found within the game with my playthrough team. It was really confusing because I believed it could have been part of the game, but it turns out I am almost certain it is not. During a part of the game, in the first half, you have to go through a series of trials, and periodically Senua will find herself with the fire graphic I had discussed earlier in the art and graphics section on her. It's flickering, it's bright, it's distracting. And you're supposed to get to a point where all of that disappears, and then you go through another section of the trial, and it can reappear again, and then it goes away. It didn't. It graphically stuck to Senua. And this happened multiple times throughout the game. It has to do with the actual graphic effect of the fire. And it even played through during the cutscene, flickering on and off, which was very strange to me. But that solidified it as a bug. The fire should not have stayed on her. And in fact, it was so distracting as I tried to look for runes for more puzzles. It was kind of almost sickening, the way it was bright and flickering and confusing and distracting. So I decided to get to a point where I saw the autosave feature, and then I closed the game entirely and reloaded it and entered the game. And I thought it had skipped me forward to a point because everything was pitch black. I'm not talking like the phase of the game where you're supposed to not have vision as Senua or the player black. I'm talking like nothing had textures black, except for the important gate and Senua herself if I could find some light somewhere. I wasn't on fire anymore, which was nice, but I could barely see what the hell was around me. So I kind of scuttled around trying to find the solution to this, and basically I just tried to progress through the game, and I found where I needed to go and moved on from there, and it fixed itself. And then I died and had to do that trial again, and the problem was no longer there. The world was not pitch black, textureless darkness. So I firmly and wholly believe this was a bug. And then the fire became attached to Senua again and wouldn't go away. So it seems like it was one or the other, and I took the lesser of the two evils there. But I would argue that this is almost a game-breaking bug. I could barely make it through the section when I reloaded and everything was just black. So this is something that needs to be fixed. Bugs aren't a reason to not buy the game, but they can be a reason to delay buying the game. And it is something that you, as a consumer, and the gaming community as a whole should be aware of exists. The other thing I'd like to note within the bug section, and this isn't really a bug, but it's a concern that isn't addressed in the warning in the game, is while playing with headphones on, I don't know if it was necessarily the motion blur of moving the camera back and forth or the bobbing of the camera as you run, which all of that happens, or the sound and how it would pop in one ear and then the other and kind of move about me, but I felt genuinely sick. I felt, and some of our other playtesters felt like they were getting sick playing the game. Their stomach felt queasy, they felt kind of dizzy or foggy-headed. Which is interesting because of the premise of the game and the whole point of being immersed in her psychosis. But I don't want to feel that as a player, and I don't think other people do either. So what we did here at YAGR is we tried playing the game through speakers instead of headphones, and it helped significantly. We were able to play longer without starting to feel that sickness, but some of us still felt it a little bit. And I think that has to do with the motion blur when turning the camera and the bouncing and things like that. But it's something that should be noted. You may experience a little bit of motion sickness or queasiness playing the game, especially with headphones. So maybe don't force yourself to play it too long in one sitting, I guess is the point I'm getting at. And it's a little concerning because I didn't think that was going to be an issue, but it certainly presented itself as one. I'm sure not everyone is going to experience this. It may have been a couple unique cases, but it is something that I want to share with you as the gaming community. I think it's a bit of a concern that should be noted for the game. Other than that, that pretty much covers our deep dive of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Quick summary: art and graphics, enjoyable, good mesh of everything that they're trying to put together, beautiful character design, lovely world design, plenty of differences throughout different levels and regions. Solid. Audio, unique way to present everything, well done. I think there was some audio track prioritization and interpretation that could have been done better on the game creation side, but it certainly doesn't ruin the game. It just adds a couple minutes of waiting around for audio tracks to play through. I think the choice of phrases used for the voices in Senua's head could have been shifted a little bit to help avoid impeding gameplay. But overall, sound design very solid, very enjoyable, and very unique. Combat gameplay, more fluid than it lets on to be, but not properly introduced, more complex than it originally presents itself, but I don't think detailed enough to enable the type of combat that they want to have in the game. Puzzle and other mechanics and gameplay, very enjoyable, unique, kind of drawn out, takes a while. There's a bit of walking simulator feel through it, but enough nuance to make it enjoyable and intriguing to someone who enjoys puzzles. Bosses, cool mechanically, good benchmarks for the game. They put too much in between the last two bosses and made it feel like one long boss fight slog to get from boss C to boss D. Plot and story, very unique and intriguing, and there's so much detail that it can drive you to want to complete the game on its own. Enough so that, frankly, it could have been made into a movie instead of a game. And finally, a severe bug that essentially removed all textures from the game or forced you to have this very distracting fire graphic on the main character, and we felt a little bit of motion sickness playing the game, particularly more with headphones on than off. So that's our deep dive on Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice here at YAGR. It is a unique experience. I don't know if it's the highest quality game I've ever experienced, but it is definitely the highest quality interactive virtual experience I have ever gone through. So I believe Ninja Theory did a good job with that. They did not really make a game so much as an experience. I still stand by that, and I think that is a reasonable representation of what we've experienced through Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. That being said, this has been the YAGR team on our deep dive for Hellblade. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you online soon.